Week 37. Summer is coming to an end, and I'm only too happy to be able to record this outside. Last week has been fairly productive. I managed to set up Kermit the log, and then use Kermit the log to diagnose and fix a UI problem I was stuck on last week. The UI problem being that the backend database insert operation would complete successfully, but the front end would then report an error. Turns out to be one of the problems I run into before. In the data layer of my app, when it performs a database insert operation, after that, it immediately fetches the exact same data back from the database for integrity purposes. And it's that fetch operation that actually had a parsing error, but because of the error handling that was set up by me, the data layer was essentially throwing a wholesale insert operation failure. So that's fixed. I improved the error handling to make sure that the insert operation failure as well as the parsing operation failure are reported separately. And number two, I fixed the parsing error, so this shouldn't happen again. So that's all fixed. After that, I moved on to the meat and potatoes of the email sending backend. And to be clear, what I'm looking to do is to set up the backend services for the app to be able to send emails. And the service providers I've selected are Resend, which is a third-party service provider that exposes their APIs for you to use to send emails, as well as Supabase Edge Functions, which is just a serverless function that you can invoke. In the first version of the app that I developed in the first half of the year, the naive implementation that I took was essentially invoking a Supabase Edge function for every single email that needs to go out. And as you can imagine, it would work for small-scale test operations, but as soon as it starts to scale, I'm going to have to be really careful with how I implement this. One of the biggest issues is that, well, I suppose the biggest false marketing that we've been led to believe is that Edge functions are serverless for sure, but they still have a setup and teardown time. And you pay for the setup and teardown time. For 1 or 10 messages at a time, that's not too big of a deal. But as you can imagine, if you start having a lot of messages, you pay extra for every single one of them for the the setup and teardown. That can get real expensive real quickly. So I need to fix that. And the second issue I was running into, perhaps not an issue yet, but it will become an issue, is that I didn't have a webhook set up for Resend to report events back into my Supabase instance. In other words, in the original implementation, it was fire and forget. Supabase Edge function didn't care whether or not the operation succeeded with Resend, if there's an error, if there requires retries, or if my recent balance has been depleted that I need to fill up or something. So it's fire and forget. That's not acceptable, especially from a user perspective. So I'm fixing that as well. So my current implementation, which will probably bleed to next week because it's a much bigger implementation than I had originally anticipated. It touches the database and the Edge functions. In my current implementation, I intend to make an Outbox and then use a cron job to drain the Outbox once, perhaps every 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And that can drastically reduce the setup and teardown that I have to pay for every Edge function that I invoke. Now, the caveat here is that what if there is an email that needs to go out immediately, right? So for instance, if there is guest notification emails, do you really want to have your guest wait up for 59 seconds before they receive it? Probably not. In that case, there will be a separate Outbox that has a shorter invocation period, perhaps 5 seconds, perhaps 10 seconds. But the principle would be the same. In other words, there would just be a drainer worker that constantly queries via a cron job that constantly queries the Outbox and then sends stuff. That's the first improvement. The second improvement is the webhook. So I'm going to set up a webhook and then set up a receiver processor to process the resend webhook events that the Supabase instance receives, and then hook it up to the database and record the events that come back from resend. So these are the two implementations that I'm looking to set up, and it's going to be this is probably one of the bigger projects or implementations in a while. It touches many different moving components, but as soon as this is set up, most of the app is done in terms of the MVP, and that's something to look forward to. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week.